Deep within the misty mountains of western North Carolina, a discovery was made that would shake the foundations of what we thought we knew about human nature. 39 children, ranging from ages 7 to 15, were discovered locked in underground chambers beneath what appeared to be an elegant manor house. The children spoke in hushed whispers, their eyes hollow with a fear that ran deeper than mere terror. When questioned by authorities, they could only repeat one phrase through trembling lips: "Master Whitmore protects us, the county sheriffs." Investigation, hidden away in the Buncombe County records for nearly 2 centuries, detailed scenes so disturbing that 2 deputies resigned within days of the initial discovery. What makes this case truly chilling isn't just the horror of what was found, but the gradual realization that Jeremiah Whitmore had been perfecting his dark methods. For nearly 3 decades without arousing suspicion, the children believed he was their savior, but the truth behind that devotion would prove more sinister than anyone dared imagine. Before we delve deeper into the twisted world of the Whitmore estate and its unspeakable secrets, I want to address you directly. The Holloway Archives isn't meant for everyone. We're here for those brave enough to confront the darkest corners of forgotten history. If you've stayed with us this far, you're different from most people. You understand that some truths are too important to ignore, no matter how deeply they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and become part of our community of truth seekers. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Are you ready to hear stories like this from your own region? The question that haunted investigators then, and continues to puzzle historians today, is how such an extensive operation could remain hidden for decades in a tight-knit mountain community. The North Carolina of 1847 was a region caught between old traditions and emerging industry. Small farming communities dotted the Appalachian foothills, where families had lived for generations, following patterns established by their ancestors. In this environment, the isolated community of Cedar Hollow, consisting of perhaps 60 families scattered across the mountain valleys, represented the typical rural settlement of the era. Most residents grew corn and tobacco, gathered at McKinnon's trading post for supplies, and met for worship services at the whitewashed chapel that served as their spiritual center. The Whitmore estate occupied a prominent position on the highest hill overlooking this community, a grand 3-story mansion built in the Greek Revival style, popular among the wealthy of the 1820s. To any visitor traveling the winding mountain road that connected Cedar Hollow to Asheville, the Whitmore property appeared to be exactly what it claimed to be: the home of a prosperous gentleman farmer who had made his fortune in timber and mining. The mansion itself, constructed of locally quarried stone and imported brick, featured imposing white columns and expansive verandas typical of Southern architecture. A carriage house, stables, and various outbuildings completed the estate layout, creating an impression of substantial wealth and refined taste. What made the Whitmore property truly unique, however, remained invisible to casual observers. Jeremiah Whitmore, who had inherited the land in 1818 from his deceased father's lumber empire, had spent enormous resources modifying the mansion's foundation and basement areas. While most mountain homes of the period featured simple stone cellars for food storage, the Whitmore basement had been transformed into something far more complex. Local stoneworkers recalled being hired for various excavation projects throughout the 1820s and 1830s, though none had been permitted to see the completed construction. Whitmore paid generously and insisted that workers focus solely on their assigned tasks. Rather than questioning the overall project design, Margaret Whitmore, Jeremiah's wife, had come to Cedar Hollow in 1820 as a 24-year-old bride from a respected Charleston family. Neighbors remembered her as an elegant woman with striking blue eyes and an uncommonly gentle demeanor. She dressed in fine clothes appropriate to her station, attended Presbyterian services regularly when her health allowed, and maintained a reputation for extensive charitable activities. When approached about community needs, Margaret would consistently explain that she and Jeremiah were already caring for numerous disadvantaged children from her extended family back in South Carolina. The arrangement, she would clarify, was charitable in nature, providing temporary homes for youngsters whose parents had died from fever or other misfortunes. This explanation satisfied the community's curiosity about the occasional glimpses of children. Around the Whitmore estate, Mrs. McKinnon at the trading post would sometimes notice a young face watching from the Whitmore carriage when Margaret came to purchase supplies. The children never spoke directly to outsiders, but Margaret would explain that they were recovering from traumatic losses and needed time to adjust to their new circumstances. The community, familiar with the tragedy of orphaned children in an era of frequent disease and accident, accepted these explanations without question. Samuel McKinnon, who operated the trading post, later recalled that Margaret Whitmore was among his most valued customers. Every 3 weeks, she would arrive with carefully prepared lists and sufficient cash to purchase large quantities of basic provisions, flour, cornmeal, preserved meat, sugar, and other essentials. The amount seemed substantial for a household without children of their own, but when Samuel mentioned this observation, Margaret would remind him about the orphan children in their care. She also purchased unusually large quantities of basic medical supplies, explaining that children from impoverished backgrounds often arrived suffering from various ailments requiring treatment. The Whitmore estate operated according to a schedule that puzzled some neighbors. While most farming families followed the rhythms of sunrise and sunset, activity at the Whitmore property often continued well into the evening hours. Lights could be observed in the mansion windows at odd times, and sounds of construction or repair work sometimes echoed across the valleys. During nighttime hours, when questioned about these activities, Jeremiah would explain that he was making improvements to better accommodate the growing number of children under their care. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the circuit physician who served the Cedar Hollow area, remembered being summoned to the Whitmore estate on numerous occasions during the 1830s and 1840s. Each time he was informed that one of the orphan children had fallen ill and required medical attention. However, Dr. Hayes was never allowed to examine the patients directly. Instead, Margaret would provide detailed descriptions of symptoms and request specific medications. When the doctor insisted on personally examining his patients, Margaret would explain that the children were too frightened of strangers, too damaged by their previous experiences, to permit examination by unfamiliar adults. The deception was so thorough that even the local minister, Reverend Thomas Crawford, believed completely in the Whitmore family's charitable mission. During his periodic visits to the estate, Reverend Crawford would praise Margaret and Jeremiah for their Christian compassion in providing for so many unfortunate children. He offered to assist in finding permanent homes for the orphans, but Margaret would always explain that she was already corresponding with family members in South Carolina who would eventually welcome the children. The process, she assured him, simply required patience and careful coordination. What none of the community members realized was that Margaret Whitmore had been perfecting her elaborate deception. For nearly 3 decades, the orphan children were not temporary residents awaiting placement with loving relatives. They were prisoners, acquired through purchase, kidnapping, or false promises from families across multiple states, held under conditions that would horrify even hardened criminals. The discovery that would expose the Whitmore family's horrific secrets began with a series of seemingly unconnected incidents in the early months of 1847. March had been particularly severe, with late winter storms dropping heavy snow across the mountain region for weeks. The harsh weather that gripped North Carolina that spring would prove to be both a curse and a blessing for the 39 children trapped beneath the Whitmore mansion. On March 18, 1847, a traveling minister named Reverend David Stone was making his way from Morganton to Asheville when a sudden blizzard forced him to seek emergency shelter. The Whitmore estate, being the most substantial building visible from the mountain road, seemed like the logical choice for refuge during such dangerous conditions. Jeremiah Whitmore, despite his obvious reluctance, could hardly refuse Christian hospitality to a fellow minister during life-threatening weather. Reverend Stone later described the evening as strangely uncomfortable. Margaret Whitmore served a simple meal of bread and preserved meat, but conversation remained awkward and strained. The Whitmores seemed nervous, frequently exchanging meaningful glances and startling at every sound from outside. When Reverend Stone inquired about the children, he had been told lived on the estate. Margaret explained that they were all sleeping peacefully and shouldn't be disturbed. The children, she said, had been battling influenza and required complete rest for recovery. What disturbed Reverend Stone most profoundly was the sound. Throughout the night, as he rested on a temporary bed in the Whitmore parlor, he could hear what seemed like muffled sobbing coming from somewhere below the main floor. When he mentioned this to Jeremiah the following morning, Whitmore claimed it was probably just wind moving through spaces in the stone foundation. Such sounds were common in older mountain homes, especially during severe weather conditions. Reverend Stone accepted this explanation, but something about the Whitmores' behavior continued to trouble him deeply. The second incident occurred 5 weeks later on April 22nd. Anna Elizabeth Garrett, a young woman traveling with her family to seek employment in the textile mills around Asheville, became separated from their group during a river crossing swollen by spring rains. Exhausted and frightened, she made her way to the Whitmore estate as darkness approached. Margaret Whitmore welcomed her inside, offering food and shelter for the night. Anna Elizabeth was never seen alive again. When her family reported her disappearance to authorities in Asheville, they described their last known location and the direction Anna Elizabeth had been traveling. A search party was organized, but the vast wilderness of the North Carolina mountains made finding a single missing person nearly impossible. The search was abandoned after 10 days, and Anna Elizabeth Garrett was presumed to have died from exposure or wild animal attack. The final incident that would lead to the shocking discovery occurred on May 7, 1847. A local hunter named Robert Mackenzie was tracking deer in the forest that bordered the Whitmore property when he heard something that made his blood freeze. From somewhere near the Whitmore mansion came the unmistakable sound of children screaming. Not the normal cries of youngsters at play, but raw, desperate shrieks of absolute terror. Mackenzie crept closer to investigate, concealing himself behind a grove of pine trees approximately 75 yards from the mansion. For over an hour, he watched and listened carefully. The screaming continued intermittently, always seeming to originate from beneath the house rather than from inside the main structure. At one point, he observed Jeremiah Whitmore emerge from what appeared to be a cellar entrance on the side of the mansion. Whitmore looked around nervously before disappearing back underground. When Mackenzie reported what he had witnessed to his neighbors, reactions were mixed. Some suggested that the orphaned children might be more troubled than the Whitmores had indicated, perhaps requiring discipline or medical treatment that could be distressing to witness. Others, however, began remembering odd details that hadn't seemed significant before. The unusual quantities of food Margaret Whitmore purchased regularly, the strange sounds neighbors occasionally heard during nighttime hours, the fact that none of the supposed orphans had ever been seen at community gatherings or church services. Sheriff William Davidson, an experienced lawman who had served Buncombe County for over 12 years, initially dismissed these concerns as neighborhood speculation. However, when Robert Mackenzie approached him directly and insisted on filing a formal complaint, Davidson agreed to conduct an investigation. The law required him to follow up on reports of potential child endangerment, regardless of his personal opinion about the complainants. On the morning of May 12, 1847, Sheriff Davidson rode to the Whitmore estate accompanied by his deputy James Morrison. They arrived shortly after dawn, expecting to conduct a routine inspection that would resolve the community rumors once and for all. Margaret Whitmore greeted them at the front door. Her manner calm and gracious, she invited the officers inside for coffee and expressed genuine concern about the gossip circulating through the community. The conversation began pleasantly enough. Margaret explained once again about the orphaned children, showed the officers letters she claimed to have received from relatives in South Carolina, and offered to arrange for the children to meet with Sheriff Davidson once they recovered from their current illness. Everything seemed perfectly reasonable until Deputy Morrison asked to step outside briefly. As Morrison walked around the exterior of the mansion, he noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The cellar entrance that Robert Mackenzie had seen Jeremiah Whitmore using was secured with multiple heavy padlocks, thick chains wrapped around the door handles. and the wood surrounding the locks showed clear signs of desperate scratching, as if someone had tried to claw their way out from the inside. When Morrison returned to the house and quietly informed Sheriff Davidson about his observation, both men realized they were dealing with something far more serious than community gossip. Davidson politely asked Margaret to show them the cellar, explaining that a thorough inspection would help resolve the rumors permanently. The change in Margaret Whitmore's demeanor was immediate and alarming. Her face drained of color, her hands began trembling noticeably, and she began stammering about how the cellar was dangerous, how the children weren't permitted in that area, how there was nothing to see except old farming equipment and storage materials. That was when they heard it clearly. From somewhere directly beneath their feet came the unmistakable sound of children crying, followed by a weak voice calling desperately for help. The sound was muffled but undeniable, and it was coming from directly below the kitchen where they stood. The immediate aftermath of that first discovery would haunt Sheriff Davidson for the remainder of his life. When he and Deputy Morrison forced open the cellar entrance, the stench that rose from the darkness below was overwhelming, a mixture of human waste, unwashed bodies, and something else that Davidson later described as the smell of hopelessness itself. The basement that Jeremiah Whitmore had spent over 2 decades constructing was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. The main chamber extended far beyond the foundation of the house above, reaching into the earth like an underground maze. Stone walls, carefully constructed and designed to muffle sound, created a series of connected rooms and passages. The largest chamber, located directly beneath the kitchen, housed most of the children. They were secured to iron rings embedded in the stone walls, each child restrained by shackles around their ankles. The chains were long enough to allow limited movement within a small area, but prevented any possibility of escape or reaching other prisoners. The children ranged in age from approximately 7 to 15 years old. They were severely malnourished, their clothing reduced to filthy rags, their bodies bearing clear evidence of prolonged neglect and systematic abuse. Many displayed signs of serious illness, fever, respiratory problems, and skin conditions that resulted from living in the damp, poorly ventilated underground environment. What struck both officers most powerfully was the eerie silence. After the initial cries for help, the children said absolutely nothing. They simply stared at the newcomers with eyes that held no hope, no expectation of rescue, no recognition that help might be possible. Deputy Morrison, a father of 3 young children, had to leave the basement twice to vomit. Sheriff Davidson, despite his years of law enforcement experience, found himself unable to comprehend the full scope of what he was witnessing. The systematic nature of the imprisonment, the evidence of long-term planning, the sheer number of victims, it exceeded anything in his experience or imagination. In the smaller chambers, Davidson and Morrison discovered evidence of the Whitmore system of control and punishment. One room contained wooden stocks and various restraining devices used for discipline. Another held what appeared to be a crude medical facility where the children received treatment for injuries and illnesses, not from compassion, but to keep them alive and functional. A third room contained detailed records that would prove essential to the investigation. Names, ages, dates of arrival, and extensive notes about each child's condition, behavior, and response to various treatments. The records revealed the true scope of the Whitmore operation. Children had been arriving at the estate regularly since 1821, shortly after Margaret Whitmore established herself in Cedar Hollow. The sources were diverse. Some were orphans purchased from overwhelmed institutions. Others were runaways lured by promises of food and shelter. And still others appeared to have been simply kidnapped from their families. The ledger showed that, over the years, more than 120 children had passed through the Whitmore basement. The obvious question, what had happened to the others, was answered in the most horrifying way imaginable, in a separate chamber, accessible through a narrow tunnel that required crawling. Davidson and Morrison found the remains of at least 48 children. Some appeared to have died from disease or malnutrition. Others showed clear signs of violence, and all had been buried in shallow graves beneath the basement floor. their bodies treated with lime to control odor and decomposition. The investigation that followed the initial discovery would continue for months as authorities struggled to understand how such a massive criminal operation had functioned undetected for over 2 decades. The answer lay in Margaret Whitmore's remarkable talent for deception and her sophisticated understanding of human psychology. She had created a public persona that was almost perfectly designed to avoid suspicion in a rural 1840s community. The character of the charitable woman caring for orphaned relatives appealed to the community's Christian values while providing ready explanations for any unusual aspects of the Whitmore household. The story of traumatized children too frightened to interact with strangers provided a convenient excuse for why the supposed orphans were never seen in public settings. The claim that permanent homes were being arranged with distant family members explained why the children never seemed to leave the estate permanently. Even more cleverly, Margaret had created multiple layers of protection for her operation. The children were conditioned to address her as their benefactor, ensuring that if anyone ever overheard them, it would seem like a natural relationship of gratitude and dependence. The rare times children had been glimpsed by outsiders, they had been carefully coached to remain silent and appear timid rather than terrified. The substantial food purchases were explained by the presence of multiple children, while the medical supplies were justified by the supposed poor health of disadvantaged youngsters. The physical setup of the operation was equally well planned. The basement construction had been spread over many years, with different craftsmen handling different aspects of the project. No single worker had seen the complete layout or understood the true purpose of the modifications. The soundproofing was effective enough that even close neighbors rarely heard anything suspicious, and when they did, the sounds could be explained as normal household activities or the ordinary noise of children playing. Perhaps most disturbing was the psychological control system that Margaret had developed over the years. The children were told that their families had abandoned them, that no one was searching for them, and that the outside world was dangerous and hostile to children like them. Those who behaved according to the rules received slightly better food and living conditions, while those who caused problems were subjected to punishments that served as examples to the others. Over time, most of the children accepted their captivity as simply the natural order of their lives. The community's reaction to the discovery was one of complete shock and disbelief. Many residents initially refused to believe that Margaret Whitmore, the refined woman who had lived among them for over 25 years, could be capable of such monstrous acts. Some suggested that she must have been coerced by her husband, or that the entire situation was somehow a terrible misunderstanding. These denials became impossible to maintain. As more evidence emerged from the investigation, the detailed records found in the basement included not just information about the children, but also correspondence with criminal contacts in other states. Margaret Whitmore had been part of an extensive network that trafficked in children, buying and selling young victims across state boundaries. The Whitmore estate was just one operation in a larger criminal enterprise that stretched from Virginia to Georgia. As Sheriff Davidson delved deeper into the Whitmore case, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested the operation was far more sophisticated than initially believed. The correspondence found in the basement revealed that Margaret Whitmore had been in regular contact with at least 15 other individuals across 6 states, all apparently involved in similar activities. The letters, written in a basic code that was eventually deciphered by a linguist from the University of North Carolina, discussed inventory management and quality assessment in language that clearly referred to human trafficking. One letter, dated just for months before the discovery, came from someone identified only as Thompson in Savannah. Thompson wrote that he had 8 new acquisitions of varying ages and conditions that would meet your specifications perfectly. The letter included detailed descriptions of the children, their approximate ages, physical conditions, and most disturbingly, notes about their temperaments, which children were compliant and which might require additional conditioning. The financial records painted an even more horrifying picture. Margaret Whitmore had been paying between $75 and $300 per child, depending on age, condition, and specific characteristics. She had also been receiving payments from other locations, indicating that the Whitmore estate served as both a destination and a distribution center for trafficked children. The total amount of money involved was staggering for the time period. Over $15,000 in transactions over 2 decades, equivalent to several $100,000. In modern currency. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the circuit physician, who had been called to the Whitmore estate on several occasions, became a crucial witness as the investigation expanded. Under questioning, he revealed that Margaret Whitmore had always demonstrated unusually specific knowledge about medications and treatments. She had detailed understanding of treating malnutrition, respiratory infections, and other conditions common in severely neglected children. She had also requested sedatives and other drugs that could be used to control difficult prisoners. The doctor's testimony led to another chilling realization. Margaret Whitmore had been systematically studying how to keep large numbers of children alive under conditions of extreme deprivation. The medical supplies she purchased, the questions she asked, even the design of the basement facilities, everything was calculated to maximize the survival rate of her prisoners, while minimizing the resources required to maintain them. Local merchant Samuel McKinnon provided additional crucial pieces of the puzzle. A review of his sales records showed that Margaret Whitmore had been purchasing steadily increasing quantities of basic supplies over the years. What had appeared to be the growing needs of a charitable household was actually evidence of an expanding criminal operation. McKinnon also remembered specific requests for items that had seemed unusual at the time: extra blankets in unusual quantities, bulk purchases of children's clothing in various sizes, and large orders of basic medicines typically used for childhood illnesses. The investigation also revealed the specific role of Jeremiah Whitmore in the operation. While Margaret appeared to be the mastermind and public face, Jeremiah was responsible for the physical maintenance of the prison system and the direct handling of the children. Several of the surviving victims, when they were finally able to speak coherently, described him as the enforcer who carried out punishments and maintained discipline through fear and violence. His construction work on the basement hadn't been merely expansion. It had been constant refinement of a system specifically designed to hold human beings in captivity while preventing escape or detection. The most disturbing revelation came from analyzing the records of children who had disappeared from the Whitmore estate over the years. The ledgers showed that some children had been transferred to other locations within the network, suggesting an organized system of buyers and sellers across multiple states. Others had been marked as problematic or unsuitable entries that corresponded directly with the remains found in the basement burial chambers. The scope of the investigation expanded dramatically as authorities in other states began examining their own records of unsolved disappearances. Missing children reports from Virginia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia showed disturbing similarities. Many of the missing children matched the profile of those found at the Whitmore estate: poor, orphaned, or from families that were unlikely to have resources to conduct extensive searches. Federal marshals were brought in to coordinate the multi-state investigation. This was unprecedented for the time period, as most law enforcement operated strictly within local jurisdictions. The Whitmore case represented one of the first major criminal investigations to cross state boundaries and involve federal coordination. The legal implications were complicated by the fact that many of the crimes had occurred in different jurisdictions, under different legal systems. As weeks passed and the investigation continued, more survivors began to share their experiences. The accounts were remarkably consistent, describing years of imprisonment, systematic abuse, and sophisticated psychological manipulation. The children described how new rivals were processed, subjected to isolation, punishment, and indoctrination, until they accepted their situation as permanent. They spoke of a complex hierarchy among the prisoners, with older children given minor privileges in exchange for helping to control younger ones. The survivors also revealed the extent of Margaret Whitmore's psychological manipulation techniques. She had convinced many of the children that they were worthless, that their families had sold them or abandoned them willingly, and that they deserved their treatment as punishment for being unwanted. Some of the older children, who had been imprisoned for years, initially resisted rescue efforts because they had been conditioned to believe that the outside world was even more dangerous than their captivity. The investigation uncovered evidence of the Whitmores' methods for acquiring victims. Margaret had developed relationships with corrupt officials at institutions and orphanages who would provide children in exchange for substantial payments. She had also cultivated contacts among criminal elements in major cities who could identify vulnerable targets, runaways, street children, and others who wouldn't be missed immediately. Perhaps most chillingly, the records showed that the Whitmore operation had been expanding significantly in recent years. The number of children being held had increased steadily, and there were plans in the correspondence for establishing similar facilities in other locations. The discovery at the Whitmore estate had apparently interrupted a criminal enterprise that was on the verge of becoming a much larger operation. The breakthrough that would lead to the complete exposure of the trafficking network came from an unexpected source among the surviving children. A girl named Sarah, approximately 16 years old, who had been held longer than any of the others, had maintained remarkable mental clarity and an extraordinary memory for details. Despite her ordeal, Sarah had been kidnapped from her family's farm in Tennessee in 1841 when she was just 11 years old. She remembered everything about her capture: how a woman claiming to be a traveling teacher had arrived at their farm, how she had been lured away with promises of education and opportunities in the city, how she had awakened chained in the Whitmore basement. More importantly, she remembered every conversation she had overheard between Margaret Whitmore and the various visitors who had come to the estate over the years. Sarah's testimony revealed that the Whitmore operation was just one component of a much larger network. She had heard Margaret discussing other estates, other locations where children were being held for various purposes. She remembered names, dates, and details about shipments of children being moved between different facilities. Her information provided law enforcement with their first comprehensive understanding of the scope of the criminal enterprise. The most significant revelation came when Sarah described a visit that had occurred just 3 weeks before the discovery. A well-dressed gentleman had arrived at the estate in an expensive carriage, accompanied by 2 associates. Sarah had been selected along with 4 other children to be examined by the visitors. The man had inspected them carefully, checking their physical condition, their responsiveness, and their general health like a buyer evaluating livestock. The visitor had ultimately decided not to purchase any of the children, complaining that they were too damaged by their experiences for his intended purposes. However, he had left behind a detailed letter containing specifications for the type of children he wanted to acquire. The letter, which was found among Margaret Whitmore's papers, described requirements for children of specific ages, physical characteristics, and psychological profiles. The language was cold and businesslike, discussing human beings as commodities to be evaluated and purchased. The letter was signed H. Richmond and included a return address in Atlanta, Georgia. When authorities investigated, they discovered that Henry Richmond was a wealthy industrialist who had been purchasing children for years, ostensibly as workers for his textile mills, but actually for purposes that the investigation would reveal to be even more sinister than the Whitmore operation. The Richmond connection opened up an entirely new dimension of the case. Industrial leaders, it appeared, had been using the child trafficking network to acquire workers who would be completely under their control. Unlike regular employees who had legal protections and whose disappearance might be noticed, trafficked children could be worked to death with no legal consequences. They had no families to search for them, no legal status to protect them, and no realistic hope of escape from industrial facilities. The investigation of the Richmond connection revealed that several other prominent business families had been involved in similar purchases. The children were being used not just as laborers, but as subjects for industrial experiments, as targets for cruel entertainment, and for purposes that investigators found too disturbing to document fully in their official reports. As the scope of the criminal network became clear, the investigation faced increasing resistance from powerful interests. Several of the families involved in purchasing children had significant political connections, and substantial resources to protect themselves from prosecution. Threats began to be made against investigators, witnesses, and even the surviving children. Sheriff Davidson received anonymous letters warning him to abandon the investigation. Deputy Morrison was attacked by unknown assailants while patrolling his regular routes. Dr. Hayes found his medical practice suddenly boycotted by several prominent patients. The pressure was clearly designed to intimidate law enforcement and prevent the full extent of the network from being exposed. The situation became even more dangerous when one of the surviving children, a boy named Michael, who had been providing crucial testimony about the network's operations, disappeared from the secure facility where he was being housed. An extensive search was conducted, but Michael was never found. The message was unmistakable. Those who cooperated with the investigation would face severe consequences. Despite the intimidation campaign, the investigation continued with renewed determination. Federal marshals provided additional security for key witnesses and investigators. The surviving children were moved to more secure locations under armed guard, and additional security was posted at the Whitmore estate to protect the physical evidence. The case had become a test of whether the American legal system could function effectively when confronted with crimes involving wealthy and politically connected perpetrators. The pressure reached its climax when Margaret Whitmore herself was found dead in her jail cell. The official cause of death was listed as suicide by hanging, but the circumstances surrounding her death were highly suspicious. Margaret had been scheduled to provide detailed testimony about the full extent of the criminal network, including the identities of all her contacts and customers. Her death eliminated the investigation's most important witness and primary source of information about the broader conspiracy. The mysterious death of Margaret Whitmore sent shock waves through the investigation team and the broader community. If powerful interests were willing to eliminate key witnesses to protect themselves, no one involved in exposing the truth was truly safe. The investigation had uncovered a criminal enterprise so vast and so well-connected that it posed a direct threat to some of the most prominent families in American society. Just when it seemed that the investigation might be derailed permanently by intimidation and violence, an unexpected development changed everything completely. A former employee of Henry Richmond, motivated by overwhelming guilt over what he had witnessed, came forward with evidence that would expose the full scope of the trafficking network. The employee, a man named Thomas Green, had worked as a supervisor in Richmond's textile mills and had direct knowledge of the children, who had been purchased from the Whitmore network. Green brought with him detailed documentation that proved the connection between the Whitmore operation and the industrial buyers. More importantly, he had personally witnessed the fate of many of the children who had been sold to manufacturing operations. His testimony would provide the final pieces of the puzzle and expose the complete horror of what had been happening to America's most vulnerable children. Thomas Green's testimony before the federal grand jury in Charlotte would become one of the most disturbing accounts in American legal history. Green, a man in his 50s with calloused hands and deeply troubled eyes, had worked for Henry Richmond for over 15 years. What he had observed in Richmond's textile mills and what he revealed about the fate of the Whitmore children shocked even the experienced investigators, who thought they understood the scope of the criminal enterprise. Green described how Richmond's industrial operation functioned on two completely separate levels. The main textile mill employed regular workers under typical, though harsh, economic conditions of industrial production. However, Richmond had also established what Green called the special facility, a separate building where the trafficked children were held for purposes that had nothing to do with textile manufacturing. The children purchased from the Whitmore network were used as subjects for industrial experiments that Richmond conducted with several associates, including engineers. From Atlanta Technical Institute, the experiments were designed to test human endurance under extreme working conditions, to study the effects of various industrial chemicals and processes, and to satisfy the scientific curiosity of men who viewed the children as laboratory subjects rather than human beings. Green's most damning testimony concerned the detailed records that Richmond maintained of these experiments. The industrialist had documented everything the children's reactions to different working conditions, their survival rates under various chemical exposures, and the progression of industrial diseases that were deliberately induced to study their effects. The records showed that Richmond and his associates had been conducting systematic torture, disguised as industrial research. The testimony revealed that at least 42 children from the Whitmore network had been sold to Richmond over the years. Of these, only 6 had survived long enough to be transferred to other buyers or facilities. The rest had died as a direct result of the experiments, chemical poisoning, or the brutal working conditions in the special facility. Their bodies had been disposed of in unmarked graves in a remote section of Richmond's property. Green also provided crucial information about the broader network of buyers and sellers. He had been present at meetings where Richmond discussed purchases with other industrialists, wealthy landowners, and even some government officials. The conversations he overheard revealed that the trafficking network extended far beyond what investigators had previously imagined. Children were being bought and sold across the entire country, with different buyers having different requirements and intended uses. The most shocking revelation came when Green described a gathering he had witnessed in the winter of 1846. Richmond had hosted what he called a demonstration for potential buyers from across the South and Midwest. The event was designed to showcase the quality of children available through the network and to demonstrate the various purposes for which they could be employed. Green's description of this gathering was so disturbing that several members of the grand jury were unable to remain in the room. The demonstration had included displays of the children's capacity for various types of work, their responses to different forms of control and punishment, and their suitability for different types of exploitation. The buyers had been encouraged to examine the children closely, to test their reactions to various stimuli, and to place orders for specific types of victims. The entire event had been conducted with the casual, businesslike atmosphere of a livestock auction. Green's testimony also revealed the enormous financial scope of the network. The prices paid for children varied dramatically based on their age, physical condition, and intended use. Younger children, who could be more easily controlled and conditioned, commanded premium prices. Children with specific physical characteristics or demonstrated abilities were sold at even higher rates. The total amount of money involved in the network was estimated to exceed several $100,000, representing a vast fortune for the time period. The investigation team used Green's information to coordinate simultaneous raids on multiple locations across the South and Midwest. Federal marshals working with local law enforcement struck at industrial facilities, private estates, and other locations where trafficked children were being held. The raids were conducted in complete secrecy to prevent the destruction of evidence and the escape of key perpetrators. The results of the coordinated raids exceeded even the investigators' expectations. Over 130 additional children were rescued from various locations across multiple states. Physical evidence was seized that documented the complete extent of the trafficking network, including financial records, correspondence, and detailed logs of purchases, sales, and transfers. Several prominent individuals were arrested, including Henry Richmond, 3 engineers from Atlanta Technical Institute, and a federal judge from Alabama who had been one of the network's most reliable customers. The evidence seized during the raids painted a picture of systematic evil that shocked the entire nation when details began to emerge. The trafficking network had been operating for over 40 years, had involved dozens of major buyers and sellers, and had victimized well over 1,000 children. The level of organization and sophistication was unprecedented for any criminal enterprise of the time period. The industrial experiments conducted by Richmond and his associates were documented in horrifying detail. The records showed that the experimenters had deliberately exposed children to dangerous industrial chemicals to study their effects, had tested various mechanical devices and processes on human subjects, and had conducted procedures without any regard for safety or medical ethics. The children had been treated as disposable research subjects. their lives valued only for the industrial knowledge that could be extracted from their suffering. The investigation also revealed the extensive corruption that had made the network possible throughout its decades of operation. Officials at institutions, local governments, and even federal agencies had been systematically bribed to provide children or to ignore their disappearances. Judges had been paid to declare children abandoned or to approve transfers that were actually sales. Even some law enforcement officials had been involved in covering up evidence and intimidating potential witnesses. The legal proceedings that followed would drag on for years as prosecutors struggled to bring justice to victims of crimes that had occurred across multiple states and jurisdictions. The complexity of the case, combined with the wealth and political connections of many defendants, made prosecution extremely challenging. Several key defendants escaped conviction on technical grounds or through the influence of powerful allies. However, the public exposure of the trafficking network had profound effects that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The Whitmore case became a catalyst for the first comprehensive federal legislation addressing child trafficking and systematic abuse. It led to major reforms in the oversight of institutions and poorhouses, and to the establishment of new legal protections for vulnerable children. The final resolution of the Whitmore case would take nearly 6 years to complete, but its impact on American society was immediate and transformative. The public reaction to the revelations was one of horrified fascination, mixed with a determination to prevent such atrocities from ever happening again. Newspapers across the country covered the story with unprecedented thoroughness, with many publications dedicating special editions to the investigation's findings. The surviving children faced a long and difficult journey toward recovery. Most had been held for years and had no clear memory of life before their captivity. The 39 children rescued from the Whitmore basement required extensive medical treatment, psychological care, and patient work to help them readjust to normal human relationships. Many never fully recovered from their ordeal, carrying physical and emotional scars throughout their lives. Sarah, the 16-year-old girl whose testimony had been crucial to exposing the broader network, became something of a celebrated figure as news of her courage spread throughout the region. However, the attention proved overwhelming for someone who had endured such severe trauma. She was eventually placed with a Methodist family in Kentucky who provided the quiet, supportive environment she needed to begin healing. Sarah lived to be 68 years old, eventually marrying and raising a family of her own, but she never spoke publicly about her experiences again after completing her court testimony. The legal proceedings revealed the complete extent of the corruption that had enabled the trafficking network to flourish for decades. Jeremiah Whitmore, who had been captured during the initial raid on the estate, was convicted on multiple charges of kidnapping, imprisonment, and murder. He was executed by hanging in Asheville on December 3, 1849, before a crowd of over 4,000 people. His final words, according to witnesses, were a confession that he had served evil masters and a plea for divine forgiveness. For the children he had helped to destroy. Henry Richmond's trial became a sensation that exposed the dark underbelly of American industrial society. The detailed records seized from his facilities provided evidence of systematic torture and murder that shocked even experienced legal observers. Richmond was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death, but his execution was delayed for years by appeals and political maneuvering. He eventually died in prison in 1854, reportedly of pneumonia, though some suspected he had been poisoned by associates who feared he might reveal additional secrets to save himself. The 3 engineers from Atlanta Technical Institute who had participated in the experiments were expelled from their professions and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Their cases led to new regulations governing industrial research and the treatment of workers, particularly children. The Technical Institute itself faced a scandal that nearly resulted in its closure, as investigators revealed that several other faculty members had knowledge of the illegal experiments, but had failed to report them to authorities. The investigation's most frustrating aspect was the number of powerful individuals who escaped justice. Despite clear evidence of their involvement in the network, several wealthy industrialists fled to Europe before they could be arrested. Others used their political connections to avoid prosecution or to receive minimal sentences that didn't reflect the severity of their crimes. A federal judge from Alabama, who had been one of the network's major customers, was quietly removed from the bench, but never faced criminal charges. The financial investigation revealed that the trafficking network had generated enormous profits for its organizers throughout its decades of operation. Margaret Whitmore alone had accumulated over $18,000 in profits during her 26 years of operation, a sum equivalent to several $100,000 in modern currency. Much of this money was never recovered, as it had been invested in legitimate businesses or hidden in accounts that investigators couldn't trace. The Whitmore estate itself became a powerful symbol of the horrors that had been uncovered. The property was seized by the government and eventually sold at public auction, but no purchaser wanted to live in a place associated with such evil. The mansion was demolished in 1852, and the basement chambers were filled with concrete and permanently sealed. A small cemetery was established on the site to memorialize the children who had died there, though most of their true identities were never determined. The case led to significant and lasting reforms in child welfare and protection systems. North Carolina passed the first comprehensive child protection laws in the region's history, establishing government oversight of institutions and requiring thorough background investigations for anyone seeking to adopt or care for large numbers of children. Other states quickly followed with similar legislation, creating the foundation for modern child welfare systems that continue to protect vulnerable children today. The federal government also responded with new laws addressing interstate crimes and human trafficking. The Whitmore case had clearly demonstrated the limitations of state-by-state law enforcement when dealing with crimes that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. New federal statutes gave marshals expanded authority to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases, establishing important precedents that would prove crucial in later criminal justice developments. Perhaps most importantly, the case fundamentally changed public awareness about the vulnerability of children and the absolute necessity for systematic protection. The romantic notion of the charitable individual caring for disadvantaged children was replaced by a more realistic understanding of the need for institutional oversight and legal safeguards. The phrase "another Whitmore situation" entered common usage as a warning about the potential for abuse in situations involving vulnerable children. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the physician who had unknowingly enabled the Whitmore operation through his medical consultations, dedicated the remainder of his career to child welfare and protection. He established free medical clinics specifically for orphaned and abandoned children, and became a passionate advocate for reforms in medical practice that would prevent physicians from being manipulated by criminals. His later writings on medical ethics were heavily influenced by his experience with the Whitmore case. Sheriff William Davidson, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to federal marshal and spent the rest of his career pursuing similar cases across the country. He became one of the first law enforcement officials to specialize in crimes against children, developing investigative techniques and procedures that would be used for generations. Davidson's detailed reports on the Whitmore case became required reading for law enforcement officers throughout the nation. The children's stories, as they emerged over the following years, revealed both the full scope of human resilience and the long-term effects of systematic abuse and trauma. Some, like Sarah, were able to build relatively normal lives with proper support and care from understanding families. Others struggled with mental illness, addiction, and other problems that stemmed directly from their traumatic experiences. A few never recovered at all, dying young from complications related to their years of imprisonment and abuse. The network's correspondence, which had been carefully preserved as evidence, provided investigators with information that led to additional cases for years. After the initial discovery, letters found in the Whitmore basement contained references to other operations, other victims, and other perpetrators across the country. Some of these leads resulted in successful prosecutions and the rescue of additional children, while others led to dead ends or situations where too much time had passed to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the gradual realization that the Whitmore operation had been just one component of a much larger system of exploitation that had existed largely undetected for decades throughout American society. The investigation revealed that similar networks had operated in other regions of the country, that children had been bought and sold like commodities throughout American history, and that the legal and social systems had been woefully inadequate to protect the most vulnerable members of society from predators. The case also highlighted the crucial role of community responsibility in preventing such atrocities from occurring. The residents of Cedar Hollow, who had lived for over 25 years adjacent to one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history, struggled with guilt and painful self-examination. How had they failed to recognize what was happening so close to their homes? What warning signs had they missed or deliberately ignored? Could they have prevented the suffering if they had been more vigilant, more suspicious, or more willing to question respectability when it masked evil? These questions led to broader discussions throughout American society about the obligation of communities to actively watch out for their most vulnerable members. The Whitmore case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of accepting explanations without proper investigation, of respecting privacy when that respect enabled systematic abuse, and of assuming that respectable appearances guaranteed moral behavior. The legacy of the Whitmore case extended far beyond the immediate legal and social reforms. It inspired throughout the country. The detailed documentation of the investigation, including the correspondence, financial records, and survivor testimony, became an invaluable resource for understanding the history of crime and exploitation in America. Historians, criminologists, and social reformers would study the case for generations, using it to understand how systematic evil could flourish in apparently normal communities, and how individual courage could ultimately expose even the most entrenched systems of corruption and abuse. In the end, the Whitmore family's reign of terror was brought to an end, not by sophisticated police work or advanced investigative techniques, but by the simple moral courage of ordinary people who refused to ignore obvious signs of trouble and suffering. Robert Mackenzie's decision to report what he had heard, Sheriff Davidson's willingness to take community concerns seriously, and Sarah's determination to testify despite her trauma, these individual acts of conscience and bravery were what ultimately exposed one of the most horrific criminal enterprises in American history. The basement chambers where 39 children were found chained have been sealed for over a century and a half, but the echoes of their suffering continue to remind us of the vital importance of vigilance, courage, and compassion in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The Whitmore case stands as both a testament to the depths of human evil and a powerful reminder of the capacity of individual conscience to overcome even the most entrenched systems of exploitation and abuse. If this story has sent chills down your spine, you understand why these dark chapters of forgotten history must never be allowed to fade from memory. Just when we thought we understood the limits of human cruelty, cases like the Whitmore estate remind us that evil can hide behind the most respectable facades, and that the most horrific crimes can be committed by those who appear most normal to their communities. If this story has captivated your imagination, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the Holloway Archives to never miss stories like this. Let's continue discovering together what other secrets lie buried in America's forgotten past. This mystery demonstrates that evil often wears the mask of respectability, and that the most horrific crimes can be perpetrated by those who appear most trustworthy to their communities. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the North Carolina mountains? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves uncovering hidden history. The darkness of America's past has many more secrets to reveal, and the Holloway Archives will be here to uncover them all. See you in the next investigation.